Canada was unprepared for the major war it was suddenly involved in. The Army had less than 5,000 regular troops, and both the Air Force and Navy were small and poorly equipped. But despite the small size of the forces and the subdued mood of the country, men and women enlisted in thousands right from the start. In the first month of the war, more than 58,000 Canadians joined up. In December of 1939, the 1st Canadian Division of 10,000 men sailed for Britain. The same month, Britain asked Canada to host an extensive training scheme for air forces of the whole Commonwealth. By the summer of 1940, troops from 2 Canadian divisions had arrived in England. Early that year, the Germans had invaded and conquered Norway and Denmark, but in France there was little for the Allied troops to do as they waited for the German attack. In May 1940, the German armies unleashed their assault on the West. Belgium, Luxembourg, and Holland were all swiftly overrun, and the Germans plunged deep into France. The French army was shattered. At the port of Dunkirk, 350,000 soldiers, mostly British, had to be evacuated across the Channel to Britain. They left behind almost all of their equipment. More importantly, they were driven from the European mainland. Shortly after, France surrendered. In 5 weeks of fighting, the Germans had won more than they had in 5 years in the First World War. For the Allies, the suddenness of the fall of France in 1940 was a profound shock. With France occupied, Canada became Britain's most powerful ally. In fact, the Canadian divisions were among the few intact fighting units left to defend Britain after the disaster of Dunkirk. In such desperate times, the Canadian government abandoned the idea of a limited war. The whole society was to be put on a war footing. The government even started conscripting men for home defense duties. At the outbreak of war, Canada's industries were still suffering from the Depression. C.D. Howe was appointed Minister of Munitions and Supply and became the driving force behind Canada's rapid industrial expansion. He sailed to Britain and, surviving a torpedo attack on his ship, returned home with massive orders for food, weapons, trucks, and just about anything else Canada could produce. Canadian factories expanded and installed modern equipment. Thousands of men and women were employed. Salaries rose swiftly. Canadian factories began to produce all kinds of equipment: warships, transport vessels, fighter and bomber aircraft, tanks, guns, and hundreds of thousands of trucks. Of course, all this had to be paid for somehow. Britain could not afford to pay for everything it bought, and Canada itself lacked the reserves to pay for the material it in turn was buying from the U.S. Some money-raising ideas from the First World War were used again, such as war bonds, war-saving stamps, and increasing income taxes. Canada also financed much of what Britain bought from her and signed an extensive agreement with the Americans known as Lend-Lease. Our armed forces grew quickly. The Army numbered more than 500,000 by the end of the war. Starting with 6 destroyers and a few dozen aircraft, Canada ended the war with the world's 3rd largest Navy and 4th largest Allied Air Force.